most of these big companies we think of as internet companies today, they actually run massive private networks. Google, Amazon, Facebook, these are some of the largest companies investing in private networking in the world. And it's not out of the goodness of their heart, right? Facebook came in and they wired up all of the Philippines with internet access because they wanted to sell people more ads. Even these big, massive internet companies ran into the fundamental limitations of the public internet and had to build systems that work around it. This is also incredibly prevalent in the financial services space. So if you look at Jump, Citadel, DRW, any of these trading firms that engage in high-frequency trading, one of the major limiting factors for them is how quickly can they communicate data between different markets to act on any type of signal that they would like to trade on. The communication of that signal is actually where the most gain exists today. Blockchains are high performance enough that they're running into performance bottlenecks based on the performance of the public internet. DoubleZero's main innovation is it's a blockchain-based coordination and management layer for independent contributions of fiber. And so for DoubleZero, what you're really paying for is connectivity. And that connectivity is always benchmarked to be faster than the public internet. And that's kind of the main reason we set out to build this, is to let blockchains be able to reach their true potential without having to resort to centralization.
Welcome to DealFlow Founders. It is an absolute pleasure to sit down with you today.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
Austin, welcome to DealFlow Founders. It is an absolute pleasure to sit down with you today. I definitely know that I have a gazillion questions that I really want to ask you. You are building one of the most hyped projects in the Web3 space, and I just think overall the tech space. So hopefully we can get through as many of these questions as possible, but it's absolutely going to be a fun time ripping through these. And the idea behind today's podcast is to more or less just dive into you as a founder. I really want to understand your journey and how you got to where you are today. And hopefully people can learn about you as a person and be inspired by how you have got to become the co-founder of DoubleZero, because I feel like within the Web3 space, a lot of the tech and the jargon sort of overwhelms people. And to be quite honest, not many people really care about it, nor understand to a super high level. So let's leave it light on the tech side and just get more into the journey. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
Cool. Well, let's rip things off. And I'm going to start with 5 fast questions. Now, these 5 fast questions you should be able to answer within 5 seconds, all right? And I know the first one's going to be super easy for you because I did do a bit of a stalk of your Twitter page. And so let's go for this. So are you a cat person or a dog person?
I have 2 cats, but my fiance has a dog. So, we've got both now.
Okay, all right. So are you sitting on the fence with that one?
No, I mean, so I've never been a small dog person, and he's like a 10-pound cockapoo, but he's grown on me over the years.
All right. Well, we'll leave that one out for the jury. Okay. All right. Well, you can't choose your fiance for this next question, but if you get to have dinner with anybody in the world, who are you sitting down to eat with?
This one's always a hard answer because I feel like all of the people that you just come up with off the top of your head are actually like kind of too constructed and hard to sit down with. I mean, Jensen's the easy answer because he seems like one of the few public market CEOs that'll actually like tell you what he thinks and what's actually going on. So I think that's a pretty good one.
All right, we'll see if we can hook it up. All right, here we go. How about if you have the ability to either fly or be invisible, what are you choosing?
Okay, well, like there's a caveat here, which is like, are we a little bit more durable too for flying? Because like flying is absolutely easy, 100%. But like, you need oxygen above like 7,000 feet. It gets very cold up there. Are we flying around in a giant like puffy, like Michelin man suit so you don't freeze to death? Like if it's like real flying where like you also get kind of like the environmental protections with it, 100% flying.
I love the practical
Invisible,
aspects
I
of
feel like
that.
invisible is not that useful.
Harry
Like
Potter
for
did pretty well
anything
with
that's not,
invisibility.
yeah, but like how many times in your life are you really like, man, I wish I could be invisible. Man, I wish I could fly is like that's got like real utility behind it. I don't know, like unless you're gonna go work for the CIA or something, like I'm not sure. Also, we can get into a whole thing about invisibility at infrared detectors, but we can skip that for now.
I think you've convinced me. Flying sounds like a better superpower than invisibility. So,
Yeah,
how
there's
about?
also all these other, sorry, just
No, you're good.
this one, there's so many problems with invisibility because what do we really mean? Is it just visual spectrum? Okay, well then like a heat gun's going to pick you up in a second. If it's really no EM emissions at all, you're just going to fall through the center of the planet because suddenly you have no charge and you're just like a neutrino. So I feel like the people who pick invisibility, there's a lot of caveats there to make that actually useful.
Yeah, you could argue the same on flying though. Like, I mean, you already highlighted them, the oxygen and the temperature. So
Yeah, but it could still like get me to Manhattan faster.
this is true. This is true. All right. Well, talking about speed, what are you going to pick? Either the Cybertruck or the Lambo?
If the Cybertruck was a good car, I'd pick the Cybertruck.
Have you been in one? Do you know it's not a good car?
It's not great. I've been in
Okay.
one before. It's impressive. It's interesting. As a truck, it's pretty terrible. Like
Hmm.
my step brother basically like drives cars off road for fun. Like he lives like way out in Western Mass, and his whole thing is like off road driving. And man, the Cybertruck is not built for anything like that. That's It's a
Interesting.
great city truck, but it's not a real truck yet.
Okay, all right. Talking about the city, I know that you are based there in New York, and New York is famous for its food. So, what is your go to when you are going down the city? Is it going to be the pizza slice, the bagel, or the hot dog?
Oh, definitely the bagel. Yeah.
Ooh, okay.
New York pizza's great. Nothing against New York pizza. I feel like there's enough people who've left Brooklyn at this point that like you can get pretty good pizza in a lot of the country. You really cannot get a good bagel outside of a few cities in the world.
Fair play. I haven't actually been to New York yet, but I'll keep that in mind when I do make it there. I'll hit you up for the best bagel shop in town.
All your bagels elsewhere are like made of bread, and it's very they seem like they're a piece of bread or something. Like a bagel is a dense object for a reason.
I'll take your word for it. I'm no bagel expert. But cool. Thank you so much for that. I always enjoy those. They're always just some random questions that I love just to dive into. But anyway, let's bring it round to DoubleZero and you, the reason why we are here today. So the metrics don't lie. And I have seen that DoubleZero has only been alive. I don't know if you call a protocol alive or dead, but has been around for 1 year. So massive happy birthday. How has the past year been for you for this ride as a co-founder?
Yeah, it's been really a pretty interesting process. So we launched the protocol, we announced the protocol to the world in December of last year. We launched a testnet in February, and we're going to mainnet in September. So we've kind of speed run the process that people normally go through of building and developing a protocol. And this wasn't the type of thing where we were working on it for 4 years in the background or something. The founding team of Matteo, Andrew, and myself really came together in the summer of 2024. So we had a few things going for us, like our initial contributor of fiber to the network, Jump Crypto. They have a global fiber network that put us about 2 years ahead of where we would have probably been otherwise. But still, we've got about 28 people working on the project at the moment between the labs and foundation teams. So we've really scaled up pretty quickly. And that's been a really interesting process because, I spent the last 4 years at Solana Foundation, but like that's not running the organization. And it's a very different process when you're actually, going through and figuring out like, okay, is this person the right cultural fit for the organization? How do we think about like headcount and planning? There's obviously a huge amount of budget management that goes into any startup and runway management and all those sorts of things. So it's been a pretty interesting process for us. We are about a year ahead of where I thought we would be when we started the project. I thought it would take us probably about 18 months to 2 years to get to a place where we had a product we were ready to launch. But we've got a pretty incredible engineering team and a lot of great folks who've been helping us out as contributors, both at Jump, at Anza, the folks at Jito we've been working with very closely as well. So it's been a pretty awesome process.
Sounds like you have a team absolutely stacked with talent to be able to rapidly develop like that. That is incredible amounts of speed, especially given what you guys are building. But before we get into the details around what DoubleZero actually is, I want to bring it back around to the classic question of your journey, particularly into the crypto space. You touched on the fact that you are within the grassroots of the Solana Foundation and Solana Labs, working with them for 4 years. And even before that, let's cast back. When did you first discover blockchain? What was it that you're like, whoa, I need to go, like, just wanted to dive right into the whole entire Web3 space?
Yeah, so I started looking into blockchain back in probably 2011, 2012, when I was in college. And this was just an interesting thing that was sort of coming up on the scene, was this idea of Bitcoin and what is this and how do we use it and all these things. And I think I kind of got into it initially through stuff that we obviously now know to be false, which is like, oh, this is a more anonymous, trustless form of payment. It's certainly trustless. It is definitely not anonymous. But this was, right around the time where we were seeing things like, WikiLeaks and Snowden and these type of things happening. And you had like folks who used to be like major journalists like Glenn Greenwald. Now it's not really clear exactly what he is, but people like that who are saying we're going to actually set up systems where we're going to do reporting on government secrets, and we're going to set up these, file encryption services where you can drop us stuff securely. And like Bitcoin sort of fit into that ethos of like, can we create alternative systems that sidestep government control or centralized control over these types of systems? A whole thing for me was kind of like, there's this now pretty famous story of this room in an AT&T building that no one had a key to and no one knew what it was. And it turns out that's where all the NSA wiretapping devices that were just warrantlessly surveilling all Americans came from. And there was this sort of idea of like, okay, if they're doing this at AT&T, like you got to believe they've got the same level of access in all the big banks and these sorts of things. But for me, the idea of like bunker coin was like a deeply uninteresting topic. It's like, okay, we've had World War III, or the government's come and, we have a police state, but somehow this like magic internet money is still going to be considered, like the idea just felt very similar to people that are like, I'm holding gold because gold's going to be valuable when the world collapses. And what they're actually holding are like ETF shares of gold, and like, good luck redeeming those pieces of paper if your, registered transfer agent doesn't exist anymore. So there's all of this like practicality stuff where bunker coin just never seemed particularly interesting to me. So I really kind of sat out crypto until 2017, where we started to see these things that for some reason were called smart contracts on Ethereum. Again, a smart contract, deeply unsexy name, very confusing, terrible name for what this is, which is just an on-chain program running in a giant virtualized computer. And so, it was one of those things where I was like, well, we don't need smart contracts, because contracts have all the normal enforcement problems of an actual contract. Because back then, people weren't really talking about these things as like on-chain computer programs. They were talking about them as almost like Oracle-based contract enforcement systems. But I was working for a fintech company in New York that was kind of, turns out, in the process of failing. And one of their last-ditch efforts to save themselves was trying to build a borrow-lend token on Ethereum back in 2017. And the project didn't work, never went anywhere. The company ended up laying off most of its staff and pivoting to something a little bit different. But that kind of got me hooked on the idea of like, well, maybe we actually can build interesting stuff with blockchain. And so I went to work for Republic, launched Republic Crypto with them, and was there basically through a bunch of like the, ICO type boom of 2018. And then worked for a few stealth companies in blockchain before joining Bison Trails, which then later got acquired by Coinbase to be Coinbase Cloud.
Cool. What a journey. And just to touch deeper a little bit on that, I know I did stalk your LinkedIn, I must confess to this, but your journey, your professional journey started out sort of in the marketing and the digital content creation space. How have you found that journey to now being like a technical founder?
Yeah, well, it actually started off in journalism if you go further back. So I spent about
Okay.
2.5 years working for NPR and then kind of the Boston Globe after that. And this public radio show called The World, which was kind of the last great international news program that kind of still existed back then. And so a lot of that stuff I got into almost sideways. Undergraduate, I was political science and environmental science and was sort of considering going the PhD route, mostly focused on like water resource management treaties and international compliance frameworks, like very kind of nerdy, deep stuff that in retrospect is very similar to blockchain and blockchain governance. Um, but the marketing and side of things was kind of just like I saw that like journalism wasn't going anywhere particularly interesting. Like I would find myself at 22 up for jobs competing with people who were like 32, and I'm just like, oh man, I'm not gonna sit here for 10 years waiting for another job slot to open up for this like mid-level position or something like that. And I kind of got bit by the startup bug. This was kind of when like Walt Mossberg and Kara Swisher were still doing, Recode, the Code Conference, and those sorts of things. And so this was kind of like, it just felt for me like I want to see what this thing in this space is all about. And marketing just happened to be the easiest way to sort of get into that. I would say the problem that a lot of people have in marketing is they don't understand the product that they're trying to market particularly well. And this is a real problem in Web 2 where like most marketing in Web 2 is kind of just gaslighting. You can't get away with that in Web 3 in the same way. Some projects can, right? We all know the L1s that are kind of zombie L1s that just continue to say, oh, well, like someday everyone will need this. And like, okay, sure. But for the most part, that there aren't a lot of new people coming into those spaces. And so, for me, it was kind of just this journey of learning more about how these systems work, and working more with engineers and kind of, I'm still not, an engineer. I'm not a coder. Like for me, it's all systems level technical. But that's very useful in this space, it turns out. And I have two incredible co-founders at DoubleZero. Andrew McConnell spent his entire career building high performance dedicated networks, and Matteo as well, a little bit more on the business side, but still like worked for the first company to run global fiber around the world. Then worked on microwave tower systems and shortwave systems. So it's been a pretty interesting journey, I would say, for them as well, coming to crypto, and for me, kind of coming to this world of high performance networking. But that's kind of, I tell this to folks all the time, like doing a company solo at this point is you have to have a really strong reason not to have a co-founder. That there's just like it is such an accelerant on performance and on output to have like two people you really trust and be working with them closely.
Absolutely. You're so lucky to have found such complementary skills, experts in all of your individual fields to come together to solve a problem which hasn't been solved before. So let's get into it. DoubleZero. Are you able to shed light to the normie speak, not too technical, around what DoubleZero is and exactly what you guys are trying to solve there?
Yeah, so DoubleZero at its core, it is like the least sexy project in crypto. It is low-level infrastructure. We're talking like fiber cables in the ground, running under the ocean. This is the system that basically moves all of the internet today. But the internet today is built on a lot of old technology standards, and it's built sort of on this massive interoperable mesh system. And so most companies that we think of as like internet companies actually don't use the internet for much at all. And the public internet's this incredible resource. You can reach anywhere in the world over an internet connection. That is just an incredible boost on productivity, economies, the idea that like you can be anyone with a laptop anywhere in the world, and you can like work for a blockchain company or submit a pull request is like an incredible innovation. But the internet is not built for performance. It's built for reachability, and it's built for sort of routing resiliency. And what that means is most of these big companies we think of as internet companies today, they actually run massive private networks. Google, Amazon, Facebook, these are some of the largest companies investing in private networking in the world. And it's not out of the goodness of their heart, right? Facebook came in and they wired up all of the Philippines with internet access because they wanted to sell people more ads. And the speed at which your Instagram reels load is a limiting factor to how many ads you're going to see in a given day when you're using their products. And so even these big, massive internet companies ran into the fundamental limitations of the public internet and had to build systems that work around it. Of course, they're using the internet for last mile delivery and sort of that short haul delivery to your phone, to your house. But a lot of what they're doing now is over private networking. This is also incredibly prevalent in the financial services space. So if you look at Jump, Citadel, DRW, any of these trading firms that engage in high frequency trading, one of the major limiting factors for them is not, how good is their data from a precision perspective. It's not how fast are their servers running at the stock exchange. It's how quickly can they communicate data between different markets to act on price arbitrages, market movements, any type of signal that they would like to trade on. The communication of that signal is actually where the most gain exists today. And it's kind of this whole thing about like, if you can be fast or you can be smart in trading, you should basically always pick being fast, because you can be smart and get something wrong. But if you have information ahead of where someone else has information, it's very hard to be wrong with that. And so we kind of like, you can ask like, what does any of this have to do with blockchain? Well, today blockchains are high performance enough that they're running into performance bottlenecks based on the performance of the public internet. And so you can kind of think about this as like, when we had just Ethereum and Bitcoin, Ethereum only does, 21 things per second maximum, and its block times are extremely long. And all of that data is very easy to synchronize over a public internet connection. But suddenly you look at something like Solana and you have 390 millisecond block times, you have 1,000 validators around the world, you have an additional 6,000 RPCs around the world, and suddenly you get into a situation where the public internet is the limiting factor in how quickly that software system can run. And there's sort of like two approaches to solving this. The first is you start co-locating everything, you put everything in one data center, or you reduce the number of validators. And if you kind of think about this like ratio of the number of validators to the speed of a network, there's a number of networks now that claim they can do or can do 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 transactions per second, but they generally have very small number of nodes. We're talking like below 100 in most cases, below 200 in pretty much every case. So Solana's got a much larger amount of validators and a much higher transaction count. So that ratio of basically node count to transactions per second, that's where you start running into limiting factors. If we were okay putting everything in a centralized sequencer or one data center in Tokyo or something like that, then, that's fine. You don't necessarily need all of this additional performance from dedicated fiber. But we believe in decentralization. We believe in global markets versus hyperlocal markets. And this is really where one of the major unlocks of blockchain comes from. And in order to sort of make that future run at a speed where it can compete with traditional finance and traditional systems, you need to be running over dedicated fiber the same way that the traditional financial industry does. The problem, though, is until now, all of those dedicated networks were run by centralized companies with one contributor. So if you're using Amazon's network, Amazon can just turn it off. Google's network, Google can just turn it off. Even if you're going to, Verizon and you're getting a network from them, someone at Verizon still has the keys and can just turn the thing off. And so DoubleZero's main innovation is it's a blockchain-based coordination and management layer for independent contributions of fiber. The same way, if you think about it, like Solana or Ethereum is a management layer for independent contributions of compute. Now, we call compute a validator, and we don't necessarily think of these as compute networks, but any type of smart contract network, what you're fundamentally paying for is the ability to run instructions on a blockchain. And so for DoubleZero, what you're really paying for is connectivity, and that connectivity is always benchmarked to be faster than the public internet. And that's kind of the main reason we set out to build this, is to let blockchains be able to reach their true potential without having to resort to centralization.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, you were working at Solana, one of the most high performant blockchains out there, and identified that it could never really perform to its full potential because it was limited by the network effect, right? And there's probably a lot of other blockchains out there that are in a similar position where they're never going to actually achieve the throughput that they actually need to achieve to be able to compete and to to get that global adoption. But with DoubleZero, this is what you guys are allowing, that sort of decentralization to grow an entire new version of the internet, a whole entire new level of connectivity, owned by not just one entity and can't just be turned off. So I want to know in terms of that high frequency trading and how you're saying that with DoubleZero is pretty much going to be competing with the traditional finance exchanges as we know them today. So what does that mean for the Wall Street of you guys there based in New York?
Yeah, we see this as something that can work very well with the existing traditional financial space. If you think about it, what happens right now is you've got maybe 5 to 7 cities that matter in the world for finance. And no one likes to talk about it being that small, but it really is when you think about major stock indices. And so a company like Jump or Citadel or DRW, that's a tractable problem. They can run private networks to these, 7 cities, and they can run it to their trading systems. And that's something that costs them, millions and millions and millions and, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars a year to run and manage. But it's a pretty tractable problem at the end of the day. But also, private networking like this is an anti-network effect business. Jump needs to build a network. DRW has to build a network. Like Citadel has to build a network. They're all kind of competing with each other for execution. The minute you look at blockchain, Solana is run in over 300 data centers all around the world. No company trying to bridge the gap between TradFi and blockchain or trying to trade on blockchain systems has the capital out there to run fiber to all of these locations, let alone kind of the economic incentive to do it as a one-off. But through this kind of consortium model, which is really what DoubleZero is at the end of the day, it's a token and blockchain-based consortium of high performance, connectivity. We're able to have network effect behind this and improve the systems for everyone. Our goals here are to improve the aggregate performance of all validator networks. And so when you look at things like, NYSE starting to maybe open up digital asset trading, when you look at what Galaxy did just yesterday about tokenizing actual equity, and not like tokenizing equity in terms of like taking an off-chain registry and moving it on-chain, but having actual records be issued on-chain, we're starting to see the line between what is off-chain and what is on-chain and what is TradFi and what is like this new DeFi thing becoming much closer. And so, anytime you see these systems converging, the factor that always creates that like maximum growth moment, it's the base layer getting faster. And like you can kind of go back through most of technology history and you can see that there's these things that precede like the mainstream adoption of something. And it usually is some fundamental form of connectivity that increases in performance. So if you kind of go back and you say like smartphones existed for a while, but there was a real different moment, like the original iPhone launching with 2G connectivity, it wasn't exactly a flop, but it was a pretty poor performer relative to other smartphones that existed at the time, in large part because it was a consumer device that didn't have good connectivity. But suddenly you see 3G and 4G come out, and we have something that goes from sort of this like Palm Pilot business oriented thing for, government people and for folks working at Wall Street and big banks to something that changes dating forever and changes taxis forever and changes like the fundamental nature of how we engage with one another. And the unlock there, yes, in part it was the iPhone form factor, but the first iPhone kind of really proves that like the connectivity and the ease of use was that main thing that changed. And I think we have a very similar story in blockchain where we have an incredible system that's really powerful for people who need it. But it's not necessarily built for people who just are kind of interested in it or looking to build like a new type of experience. Consumer blockchain, it's here, but it's in its infancy. And I really think that if we can get these networks moving at speeds where they deliver performance similar to Web 2 applications, they have, 1 million transactions per second of capacity, that's going to change fundamentally what you can build on top of a blockchain system.
So talking about the builders are going to be benefiting from DoubleZero, how about the average retail user? Are they going to be able to notice any difference on, say, the consumer level where I'm sending a picture or a video to my friends or family? Is it going to go down to that level, or is it mainly based and focused on that developer level and creating that sort of environment?
Yeah, so I mean, the question kind of here is like when Intel or AMD releases a new CPU, like do users notice? And the answer is like directly, no. Indirectly, absolutely. The fact that the cost of AI inference has come down so dramatically, is in large part due to hardware innovations that allow people to get more power out of the same dollar, right? The performance per dollar decreasing changes what people are able to do. I think like one good analogy here is like solar panels and like renewable
Hmm.
energy. And those were systems that, 15 years ago, you were paying a premium to use, right? You for some reason, right, whether you're very concerned about air pollution or like you just, you were in a situation where you couldn't get stable power from a grid in some other way, you were choosing these type of energy sources despite of their disadvantages in
Mm.
cost. And that's where we've been with blockchain for a very long time, right? People who live in countries that have weak financial systems or they have very authoritarian governments, they've gotten the pitch of Bitcoin and stablecoins forever, right? They're like, oh, you mean I don't have to go to the bank and fill out forms and maybe be allowed to take money out of my account? Sign me up for this. In the United States, like we've got a pretty good banking system, despite of all of the the problems we've had in it. But like this is a very politically stable country relative to pretty much anywhere else in the world. And our banking system is the envy of the world as well. It's a little harder sitting here in the United States to say, like, we have a fundamental need for Bitcoin and stable coins in my day to day life. So that's kind of like there will be a transition point where these systems, and we're already seeing this with Circle and Stripe building their own payment focused L1s, where blockchain systems are going to go from something where people who truly believe in it or truly need it use it to something very very similar to solar panels and wind turbines, where it's like if you just need to provide X amount of power and you're okay with some of the variability, it's much cheaper than any other fossil fuel source to put in these type of systems. And I think blockchain is going to get to that place pretty soon. The amount of savings in compliance and security software and all of this type of thing that you get just by implementing blockchain based payments is huge. And I think that's where folks see like a really big margin and that being a really disruptive technology.
That's a really fair point, like you said, and how with time and as technology sort of evolves, the cost and the user adoption they sort of work inversely. So, and I agree, it's the same, like you said, with solar power panels, and I saw it with PayWave actually quite specifically when PayWave or Google Pay first came out. I remember there was like a limit of only $50, and then everyone was sort of my friends are saying,
Right.
it's gonna be stolen, and then all your money's gonna be wiped out, and now fast forward 10 years, it's like, oh, you don't have PayWave, you don't have Google. It's so inconvenient to now pay with cash. So I think with time and as the technology uh, develops and the price comes down, that's when the users start to feel those massive advantages. But sorry, you're
Yeah,
going to say
we see
something?
this even with like yeah, just so like we kind of forget that PayPal was founded to solve a problem of no one trusted transacting on eBay. And now PayPal is like a much more valuable, larger company than eBay. Like no shade at eBay, but like it's really interesting how sometimes like the solutions that a company has to build to a problem it has for its growth actually becomes like the true interesting killer product.
Absolutely. So to bring it back around to that, let's talk about emerging markets. I have a sweet spot for Africa, and I always have, and I've always known that blockchain technology as a fundamental is just better than what is currently out there from all of the centralized systems that have just had that first mover advantage and the big tech and all of that. So my thesis is that Africa are going to jump straight past Web 2 and jump onto Web 3. Do you think this is going to happen? And is DoubleZero positioning themselves to provide that infrastructure within the African continent?
Yeah, the biggest like to overgeneralize Africa, like the biggest issue that it has from an economic perspective is extremely intrusive governments into private businesses. The corporate tax rates in many countries in Africa are 40 to 50%. and there's huge amounts of capital controls. These are some of the same problems you see in like Latin America and some of the, you used to see in other countries in Asia as well. Very strict capital controls on how you can move money. And so one of the challenges with blockchain is it does not comply with capital controls, right? You can't program capital controls into a Bitcoin transaction or a Solana transaction in that same way. And so governments still in a lot of places view this as a adversarial technology as opposed to a technology that can open their markets, that can, give them actually more control over their trade, all these types of things. There's a company on Solana called Agridex, and they're basically an agricultural commodities exchange. And, a lot of the work they do is on the African continent. And they've just been able to get, pretty substantial margin savings by implementing and using blockchain technology there. So I think there's a possibility here, sort of the way that like cell phone based payments in a lot of East African countries leapfrogged. No one uses credit cards and debit cards for the most part. They use cell phone based payment systems. But it does require a certain amount of integration into the traditional financial system so you can get the money off the blockchain back into your, bank account if you need. The risk here, I think, that a lot of governments see is they lose control of their capital markets. And this is like a very sort of neo-mercantilistic view of economic systems that almost goes back to the way that like the world economy ran in the 20s and 30s before World War II and Bretton Woods and all these things that changed afterwards. I don't want to get too deep into economic history and theory here, but like if you think about this as like a balance of accounts type system, what a lot of countries are worried about is basically capital drain and their currency trading more freely against other currencies. And this is where you kind of see this bifurcation. You have some countries that are really locking down and saying, no Bitcoin, no Solana, no Ethereum, no crypto transactions at all. We're going to kind of like pretend this stuff doesn't exist. And then you have other countries like Ukraine, like El Salvador, like Argentina to some extent, embracing digital assets and saying like, look, we see this inevitable future, in their view, inevitable. Like we really need to start acquiring Bitcoin, or we really need to like what Ukraine has done about actually adopting like blockchain based payment systems. That came from the fact that when Russia invaded, they were cut off from the SWIFT network. They couldn't send wire transfers out to like get supplies and armaments and all these things. Whatever you sort of might think about these wars, like supply chains are usually what win wars more than anything else. And so using blockchain based payment systems just removes a huge barrier from those types of systems as well. And so there's a lot of different ways to kind of look at this. Connectivity in Africa, to come back to your original question, is still quite expensive, and it's expensive still because of governments. And so, I think there's a validator down in South Africa now that's running about 2 million sold. So that's like pretty impressive to see they're able to actually attract stake and operate down there. But when we're kind of looking through Africa today, the physical security in a lot of places is not high enough for like, quite frankly, high performance fiber lines to exist terrestrially. And so most of the connectivity is around the ring of the continent and the coastal countries. And so, our long-term goal is to basically build 3 loops around the world. We've got kind of a northern route, sort of an equatorial route, and then a southern route as well, because that not only gives you additional resiliency and decentralization, but it lets you start being able to serve additional markets. And Facebook actually just announced a few months ago they're spending $10 billion to build a high performance, high data cable that actually will run across the southern hemisphere, because right now almost all the cable systems run across the northern hemisphere.
Wow, that's super interesting. I didn't realize that. And it actually brings around to another question that I was wanting to, I think you almost answered it, but not super directly. But so looking forward in the future of DoubleZero, are you guys going to be actually having your own infrastructure, laying your own cables? And would that be, say, owned collectively by your community?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this just depends on where the protocol goes and how quickly it develops.
Mm-hmm.
There are these things called cable consortiums, which are groups of entities that come together and say, hey, we all want to put in capital to basically collectively build this cable system. And so This is often what, Facebook and Amazon and Google and folks were doing in the early days. They were like, we don't have the expertise building cables, but we can provide 80% of the financing, and in exchange we'll get 80% of the capacity of this cable system once it's built. The other 20% gets sort of sold off and helps pay for operations. And so these are the types of models that, in the future, if DoubleZero is sufficiently valuable, the network can join into these type of consortium agreements as well. Now, I will say that the network, very similar to how like the Solana Foundation does not actually run validators itself. The DoubleZero Foundation and Malbec Labs, we don't run fiber infrastructure ourselves. It is all contributed by independent contributors. And so there's just a little bit to work through there about like, how do we make sure that we, as the DoubleZero Foundation, don't become a centralizing party if we are suddenly investing in, the highest performance fiber on the network. And so there's a lot of ideas that we've been kicking around, sort of like how in Europe the fiber is most often owned by the government, the same way airwave spectrums are owned by the government in the United States. But then it's sort of like auctioned off or leased off at a bit of a cost plus model. And so the contributors get access to that fiber at a lower cost than the open market would dictate. The government gets a little bit of revenue, and you kind of end up running it as like a business, what would you call it, like a government business development style activity. And so that's kind of one of the models we may look like in the future. But I would say us building our own fiber lines is still a little ways out.
I think you have the right team behind you to help you out on that. But we'll see where the roadmap takes you guys. But I know that currently you guys have 9 independent bandwidth contributors to your network at the moment. And I read somewhere that if you guys get to 20 independent contributors, you will become the first decentralized internet provider. Is that the case? And what is your roadmap to looking to expand from 9 to 20? And why has nobody else done this before?
Yeah, so the 20 number basically comes from the number of tier 1 ISPs out there in the world. And there's really only 20 companies that run the internet today. They do a pretty good job of it, but then, you may think like, "Oh, but I have this like small carrier locally no one's ever heard of." There are tier 2 and tier 3 ISPs that provide more sort of local connectivity or, statewide or regional connectivity. But at the end of the day, when you think about companies that actually have subsea or long haul terrestrial infrastructure, there's really only 20 companies out there that offer that. And so today we have 10 independent contributors. So you could sort of say we're halfway there from a Nakamoto coefficient perspective. But our hope is over the long term, we actually have these tier 1 ISPs and carriers joining DoubleZero and providing network connectivity to it because they view it as an alternative monetization model for these assets they have that are, worth billions of dollars. But most of them today are kind of in this sort of uh, like telecom is a very stable business, but it's not a massive growth business especially in developed markets. There's a lot of private equity involved in it, and there's a lot of firms that are looking these things to throw off 5 to 7 to 8% per year. And so if we can create kind of a new, renaissance in this connectivity by changing the fundamental billing model from one that works on, long-term USD contracts to ones that are based more on tokens, I think there's a lot of potential to spur additional growth and development of that physical infrastructure layer. You kind of look and you see like, I'm sure like pretty much everyone has seen the charts on Twitter of like China's electrical capacity generation versus the United States. And China's like just up and to the right. The US is pretty flat across the board. It's not quite as bad in telecom, but it is fairly similar, and it's not a US problem necessarily, but it's kind of a global problem of there's not a huge amount of investment going into the underlying layers at this point. Don't get me wrong, there's companies spending a lot of money and building very good stuff, but that number is not accelerating at the pace that the internet usage is accelerating. And so part of our hope here is that we can change a bit of the fundamental model behind this stuff, and we can, find ourselves in a bit of a better spot at that point.
Sounds like you are heading down the right track of it. And I know that you're only currently on Testnet and you're already getting these major partners on board. So at the moment, are you treating your Testnet launch like a mainnet launch? And what changes are you going to be making when you transition from Testnet to Mainnet in the coming months?
Yeah, so we actually have our testnet up and running at the moment, and that is, about 8 different fiber links around the world. That is run on, a few different contributors are involved in that. We've got about 15% of Solana mainnet stake actually running on that today. So our testnet, although we sort of set out for it to be a testing network, it's gotten a lot of adoption from folks, and so we are actually treating that like a asset we have to be very secure about. We're not rolling out software updates quite as quickly as we would. And this is part of why we're launching Mainnet in late September. Is our Mainnet beta will have much larger fiber connectivity. It'll have much higher speeds. It's not the final form of the protocol in any means, but it is something that will add a ton of value, we think, today. And it will also, quite frankly, free up testnet for us to go back and treat it like something we can break constantly. Because right now we actually we're treating it as something that needs to be as stable as our mainnet is likely to be. And that's kind of one of the really cool things, I think, is again, I really, this is the least sexy project in crypto, but somehow everyone's really excited about it, which I'm very happy about. But I thought this was going to be like a hard education for a year or two to get people to understand the power and the potential and the performance of high performance dedicated networking. But it seems like folks in crypto are pretty primed for this already, and so we want to get out a network that they can actually kick the tires on, have protocol developers start thinking like, what new architectures can I build if I assume I have 100 gigabits per second to pretty much anywhere in the world of low latency, high performance, low jitter networks?
Yeah, you're really removing a lot of silos that have already existed over the past 10 years for these blockchain developers. And do you think that's why you have managed to create so much of a storm and marketing hype around you guys? Or is it you to be able to, I guess, come on in and to attract so many people, and now you're actually having to take your testnet very seriously across all aspects? It's not a I say rip, shit, and bust sort of network. It's a real deal. So is there some sort of marketing aspects from, your own marketing background, some techniques that you guys have been using, or has it just been that the tech is fundamentally better and it's just what everybody's been waiting for?
I don't think there's any secret sauce to it besides build something useful that people want. There's so much stuff in the blockchain space that like no one wants and isn't particularly useful, but like there's kind of this like thesis of if we can only do this and this and this, then we can do this. And so often I see like the biggest piece of feedback I give folks that are thinking about becoming founders is a lot of them are like, I need to build this so this will happen. And those two things are often not correlated unless you already own a bunch of that crypto asset. And that's like
Mhm.
not a good reason to build a company. That's a good reason. Like they're basically doing a technical version of what Tom Lee has been doing, where they're like, oh, if I build this thing, it'll be very useful. There's so much tooling in Ethereum that really are basically software nonprofits and should never have been built as companies that can raise venture dollars or launch a public token. They should have been grant funded. And we at Solana, I think, have done a better job when I was there about grant funding things that actually are public goods as opposed to trying to tell people to go raise money off of them. Um, and I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind is like if what you're building is fundamentally open source tooling that has no real monetization idea behind it, like like make sure you're being honest about the type of company you're building. And that's awesome. You should totally build that as a nonprofit software tooling company. Um, but like you have to approach things differently if you're trying to build the Linux foundation than if you're trying to build Google. And I think a
Uh,
lot of people trick themselves into building Google, and really what they're building is the Linux Foundation. And Linux Foundation, obviously, the most valuable piece of software that no one's ever monetized directly is Linux. And so it's not, that's not to say you shouldn't do this at all. It's just you have to like. There's this old, I forget who used to say this, but there's an old like Web 1 guy that was basically said like you ship your org chart. Like your organizational structure and the organizational chart you build is the product you ship. It shows what your priorities are implicitly, even if you don't know what they are explicitly. And so we see a lot of these companies that really should be set up as nonprofits and software foundations with org charts that look much more like high growth startups. And I think that's why a lot of them crash and burn when they actually have to have people use their product and pay for it.
So don't just be a tech bro and a crypto bro. Actually build with purpose and solve real problems, and then I guess everything else falls into place. Or else you just sort of crash and burn in your own little man glory in the corner. So I want to follow up on that. What is your opinion on KOL campaigns? Is it a yes or a no from you? And are you using them on DoubleZero?
We haven't done any to this point. I mean, one of the things that is important is clearly communicating about what you're building. And some KOLs can be useful there. I think probably the problem with the term is it doesn't mean anything anymore. If it's just someone with a big following, that includes everyone from like Mert to Andrew Tate. And there's like a real big difference between those two people when it comes to what they're talking about in crypto. And so I think if you're educating people about what the thing you're doing does, like, for example, we don't have anyone on our team that speaks Mandarin. So if we're trying to communicate in that market, like what we basically have to do or work with people who I guess you might call KOLs in some way, but like, is Packy McCormick a KOL? Like, I guess maybe like the term doesn't really mean anything, but people who have audiences that overlap with the audience that you are trying to reach, like that is just called advertising, right? Philip Morris didn't advertise on Edward Murrow's show because they thought he was a KOL. It's because he had an audience they were trying to sell cigarettes to. And this is kind of how these things work. Is I think we've kind of just rebranded a bunch of terms that are fundamentally the same thing. So I don't know. KOL just to me often.
Yeah. I was going to say
like
Web3 does love jargon, and I didn't know what a KOL was until I came into this whole entire ecosystem. I'm like, what is a KOL? And now it rolls off my tongue, so I'm criminal to my own words.
Thing is it comes from like LinkedIn bros, basically.
Okay.
Right. This was sort of it's like the evolution of like thought leadership, whatever thought leadership actually means.
You're now educating me on this. So I'm also new into sort of the LinkedIn crypto bros, crypto Twitter, and it's a little bit ancestral at times. But anyway, it's part of what we have to deal with.
Yep.
But anyway, I guess you just mentioned, like you said, you've got nobody who really speaks Mandarin or Mandarin native in your team, and you guys have grown massively over 1 year, raising $28 million. And you must now need to strategically allocate that across all divisions to make sure that you guys maintain runway and can build and grow awareness and everything that you guys are putting forward there. So what do you do to make sure that you maintain a culture with this rapid development within your whole entire team? I'm assuming it's also remote. So how do you sort of, nurture and create culture within the DoubleZero team?
Yeah, when we're building something very quickly and everyone's kind of very performance minded, like you're spot on that it is tricky to build culture, to be careful about things drifting. I always say that like culture is made more by who you fire than who you hire. And that the negative
spicy.
culture I mean, but like people think about this the wrong way is because they're always like, oh, will this person be a good culture fit? And really what it is like culture moves and evolves over time and it changes within an organization. And if someone is not a good culture fit, the organization may just have moved around them. And, really what it is like you hear this all the time about sort of companies that have like a certain size of company can like put the people who are really hard to work with off in a corner and just let them do work and occasionally contribute back to other stuff. You don't get that luxury in a startup. A startup is not a place where you can have people with strong disagreements, hating each other, or saying, oh, I won't work with that person. It's like, okay, well, one of you two has to go then in a startup because there's only, 30, 40, 50, 70 people here. You don't get the luxury of being able to avoid them or transfer to a different department. And also, I think people underestimate how much that like individual toxicity can affect group productivity. Like if your 10x engineer is impossible to work with, you're probably taking all of your other 5x engineers and turning them into 3x engineers. And so like people often view like, oh, I can't get rid of this person because they're such a high performer. It's like, well, maybe that's true. Maybe what you're actually seeing is all the people who work around them now, there's a performance tax on them, which means their contribution isn't as valuable. Or maybe the answer is, hey, this 10x engineer, like they actually are 10x better than everyone else. So what we need to do is hire more people who are capable of working with them. And suddenly that becomes a hiring criteria that, you wouldn't have thought before, is like, oh, can handle this type of asshole. Like, just be honest with yourself about like what you actually need to build from a cultural perspective. One of the interesting things we have is we basically have 4 Slack channels, and no one's allowed to create any more Slack channels. Like I've come from organizations where there's like 150 Slack channels. And kind of what we're trying to do as a remote organization is replicate the feeling of like walking by a conference room and seeing someone presenting something and being like, oh, that sounds interesting. Let me go see what they're talking about. And by just having 4 channels, it kind of forces everything into public with high amounts of information availability. And our thesis is that that'll produce a company that has a remote company that has more idea of what's going on. Who knows? We'll see. It might be a disaster if we get to 70 people, but for now it's working pretty well.
That's awesome to keep all divisions up to speed with what you are building simultaneously around the world across all time zones is quite a challenge. But it sounds like, I like this idea of what you guys are doing to, keep it simple. And I think by doing that, also, you're allowing everybody to contribute, and also, if they want to contribute, so I feel like the best ideas are always developed when you have such a diverse people around the table, and there's a marketing expert, a technical expert, maybe somebody from a different culture or different experience. When you get all the different varieties of peoples and cultures and backgrounds in a room, I feel like that's when the best ideas are developed. So perhaps 4 Slack channels is the way to do it. Less noise and just keep it simple, right?
Yeah.
So coming back around to this, you just spoke a little bit around hiring and firing. So I'm sure these are probably very difficult leadership decisions that you've had to make. Are you a natural leader, or is this something that you have had to rapidly learn?
I think you have to ask people who work for me.
All
I
right,
think it's very hard for someone to assess themselves in this category. I don't know. Maybe this isn't exactly your question, but I think 2 or 3 years ago, if you'd asked me, oh, are you going to be a founder or a co-founder of a protocol, I would have said probably not. But the project finds you at some point.
Exactly. And I really think that your true skills in leadership is, like you said, discovered. And when you're put in a position to perform, you're obviously over excelling in that at the moment. And when push comes to shove, you make those decisions upon your gut feeling and your experience, and it's working out so far. So on my interpretation, I would like to say that I think that you're a good leader, but I'll check around with the rest of the team and we can confirm on that. But I guess we can, coming back around to also you as a person, I mean, it sounds like it's been an incredible year of growth, hard work. And so what do you do yourself to maintain some balance? Do you do some yoga, or sort of like, what do you do outside of bashing the keyboard?
There is no such thing as work-life balance at an early stage startup, especially if you're a founder or co-founder of it. I think one of the biggest lies anyone's ever told themselves is you can achieve work-life balance while producing high output at a high-growth organization. It's a complete lie, and anyone who does it is likely not pulling their weight for the rest of the organization.
That's a
my hot
really
take.
strong statement, and I think it's I think it would be almost a little bit controversial with many people, because they say, that you got to go touch the grass. That's the
Sure, which is not to say that, like, I mean, like, we go on walks every day. New York has great parks and those sorts of things. I still go out to dinner, but the idea that like working at a high growth startup is not a 10-hour a day minimum job is, you're just lying to yourself at that point, and you're probably letting down your team, and you're probably not going to get promoted. And that's not to say like, oh, there are individuals, but it's usually on the engineering side that what they're doing is they may not be sitting in front of a keyboard 10 hours a day. I don't think is necessarily useful. And I'm not a big believer in sort of like performance, like performative metrics of how much you're working, but like your brain is on it constantly. Even like the number of times that like I get a call from like Matteo or Andrew, and it's like, 7 a.m. and they're like, so I was thinking about this thing last night while I was trying to sleep. And like, it is just, you live it, you breathe it. It's 24/7 in your head. Um, and that applies to a lot of our employees too. Like a lot of the folks who work for me, we'll get like, we have this whole policy of like, you're allowed to send Slacks on the weekend. Because I think a lot of people worry that they're like, but you don't have to respond to them necessarily on the weekend, but like you should feel comfortable sending them because people have ideas all the time. Um, and but just to go back to this, like maybe when you're at the side, like a larger company and like things have relaxed a bit, you get a little bit more work-life balance. But if you're joining a startup and you're thinking work-life balance is important, you're either not actually joining a startup, you're joining like a pretty late stage company that just hasn't gone public yet. Um, or you're lying to yourself about what's possible. I see, I like, I have a good friend who sort of, was trying to like work life balance optimize and working at a startup. And I was like, man, you gotta go work for a more traditional company if you want this type of lifestyle.
Yeah, I think I've come around to what you're saying. Turning up at 8 a.m. and shutting off at 5 p.m., that's a whole entire different type of professional occupation that you're doing. As a founder, there's a fire inside your belly that's always burning. Your brain is always ticking, thinking about solving something or whatever is the most important fire to be putting out at that time. So, like I said, it's just a feeling and thought that doesn't turn off, and that's why you are the person to be building this, right? It's like you can't switch it off. You won't stop. And it's not a 9 to 5. It's a 24/7. But you're not necessarily sitting at your computer 24/7. But it's just a thought process that's in the background of your mind, right?
Yeah, and you have to be comfortable with this too. I think that there's a lot of these ideas of like, oh, you shouldn't work all the time. And you shouldn't work all the time if you don't want to work all the time, right? You see these stories of people who are like, oh man, like I wasted my 20s and most of my 30s, like at McKinsey doing something I hated, getting paid a huge amount of money, but like I hated work all the time. But I knew I could afford that like 5,000 square foot place in the Hamptons someday if I did. It's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, get serious about what you care about in life. Like, you're not making good choices. If you are waking up motivated and excited and like you are interested in this stuff and like you really love your job and you're working a ton, like no one ever gets mad of like, oh man, this like sculptor or painter, like all like their work life balance is terrible. All they're doing is making art all day and selling it for a lot of money. Like no, because like they clearly love what they're doing. And like work life balance is just not a priority. I think the people who really need like to take an evaluation of what they're doing is people who are working a lot and hate their job.
Mhm.
Like if you're working a lot on a project and you're there just for the large paycheck, you are just going to be miserable when you hit midlife. Like
Yeah.
you really need like the thing you are doing for most of your waking hours, you should find it gives you energy. You should find you enjoy it. You should make sure that it's something not every day necessarily, but like the net average is good.
I agree. You got to be enjoying what you're doing because you've got a certain amount of time on earth, and most of that is spent working. And not everyone's work is the same, but if you're enjoying it, some people might really in love coding, and some people might really love painting. It's like everyone's got their own thing that they want to do with their day, right? And if you're enjoying it, then it's not considered work. Well, that's what they say, right? If you're enjoying it, it's not work. So I want to know, just before we sort of wrap this up, we're carrying on through the hour, but throughout your professional journey, I want to know, has there been a specific person or maybe mentor that you have turned to or looked up to or admired, read about, that has helped you just become the person that you are today?
I would certainly say from like a running a company perspective, like spending 4 years working for Anatoly and Raj was just a master class in like how to respond to stuff coming from directions you don't know about, how to keep a team focused. They've done a really great job building Solana along with the other co-founders there and the sort of founding team members. So that was kind of the best front row seat you could have asked for something like this.
What about somebody outside of the crypto world?
Yeah, I think there's there's a lot of stuff about like never meet your heroes, and I think that's like largely true because you build people up to be something in your head. I don't have like an individual or something that I can turn to and say like, oh, this is like a really, but I think I read a lot, and so you take a lot of things from a lot of different places and sort of build up your own version of an LLM about like what you think kind of matters in the world, and people who move about it and sort of ways that you'd like to emulate. I don't think I have a individual or specific answer for that though.
A lot of influences that you would have picked up
Yeah.
across your times, I think. So, in saying that, do you have a message that you would say back to your 17-year-old self?
I think one thing people spend a lot of time when they're younger worrying about is like, am I on the right track? Or is
Mm.
what I'm doing like productive for the moment? And I think a lot of that is misplaced. I think as long as you are continuing to learn, be curious, as long as you're spending time on things that you think are expanding your worldview, like, I went to a liberal arts school and my first job paid me $28,000 a year. And like all my friends from high school were like engineering majors and, we're getting these high paying jobs and stuff. And like, I, it- it's one of these things where it's like a lot of this type of investment you do in yourself, it compounds very slowly, but it compounds at a higher rate. I would say you're starting from a lower base, but the compounding is faster, is sort of the way to put that. And I think that's kind of just like be honest about what you want to do and what your objectives are. And if what you're doing actually supports you getting there, if you're long term curious and you sort of have this open minded approach, like don't focus as much on something. But if you're like, I want to be this job title at this point, like Gantt chart it out, figure out like what it actually means, and also figure out why you want that. Do you want that because your dad always said that job was cool?
Mm.
Do you want that because you watch Succession? Like, what are you actually interested in?
That's yeah, I can hear what you're saying, and I see that coming through in your role there at DoubleZero. And I want to thank you so much for chatting with me this past hour. But for anybody else that is listening, watching, how can they follow you, follow the project, make sure they don't miss anything with the upcoming mainnet? What is the best way to get in touch with you guys?
Yeah, doublezero.xyz will have kind of all the info on the project. And we're very reachable on Twitter as well.
Thank you so much for joining me, and best of luck with everything moving forward. And I'm really excited for what you guys have got going on. And Mainnet is almost ready to go. So let's rock and roll.
Yeah, definitely. Appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.